Friends, today we are examining a development that sharply illustrates the world's shift away from the old power arrangements that defined the last century. Russia has officially agreed to supply Yemen with advanced Sukhoi fighter aircraft, including the Su-30 and Su-35 models, despite years of war, sanctions, and attempts by Western powers to isolate both nations. To understand why this matters, we have to step away from the headlines and instead ask the deeper economic questions that lie beneath every geopolitical story. Who benefits? What contradictions created this shift? And what does this reveal about the changing global order? Let us start with Yemen. For nearly a decade, Yemen has been portrayed as nothing more than a battlefield, a failed state, a humanitarian catastrophe, a tragic footnote in Middle Eastern politics. But what is rarely emphasized is Yemen's strategic location. It sits beside the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow passage through which nearly 10% of global trade moves, connecting the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. The world's container ships, oil tankers, and naval fleets rely on that waterway. Control over it grants tremendous power that Western nations long assumed would remain in the hands of Saudi Arabia, its allies, and the American military presence in the region. But Russia has now entered the scene with a deal that could eventually allow Yemen to influence that global artery. Why does Russia want this? Consider the state of its economy since sanctions were imposed after the Ukraine conflict. Russia has been cut off from many Western markets, banking systems, and technology sectors. But one sector remains strong and in demand: the arms industry. Selling sophisticated fighter jets is a source of hard currency, industrial employment, and geopolitical leverage. And so Russia says to Yemen, if the West will not help you defend your sovereignty, if your skies are filled with foreign drones and planes, then we will arm you so that you can exert control instead of being controlled. That message alone is enough to unsettle Washington, Riyadh, London, and Brussels. Economically, Yemen's government is signaling something equally important: no longer will it be dependent solely on Saudi aid or on Western diplomatic permission to rebuild its military. Yemen is saying that sovereign nations should be able to choose their own partners, and if the West won't support Yemen except under conditions of subservience, then Yemen will find partners who treat it as a buyer, not a pawn. It is a message about dignity as much as defense. But nothing in global politics comes without deeper structural issues rooted in capitalism. The United States dominates global arms markets not because it produces the only capable weapons, but because it uses those sales to enforce political loyalty. When a country buys F-35 or F-15 jets, it becomes locked into American supply chains, parts, maintenance, software updates, and training. It becomes a dependent client. Russia, by contrast, has built its global influence on offering weapons without those political strings attached. Yemen sees this difference. Many other countries do as well. That is why the Global South, which for decades was told it must accept Western direction or remain weak, now views Russia as an alternative source of power. This is not simply about jet fighters flying over a devastated land. It is about whether a country long written off as broken can re-enter global politics with a measure of control. Yemen's working class has endured famine, currency collapse, fuel shortages, and unemployment created not by economic failure alone, but by war imposed from beyond its borders. When those people look at a government acquiring jets that rival the best the world can offer, they see a symbol that Yemen will not permanently remain helpless. A sovereign military can become the backbone for a sovereign economy, if, and only if, Yemen's rulers combine military investment with rebuilding industry, agriculture, and public infrastructure. So this deal marks a dramatic shift. It announces that Yemen rejects the world order in which it is merely a battleground for foreign interests. And it also announces that Russia refuses to let the West dictate where it may project influence. The consequences of this shift will ripple far beyond the Red Sea. The question now is not whether Yemen will change, but how the rest of the world will respond to that change, and whether this moment becomes the catalyst for a broader transformation of power in the Middle East and the global economy. To appreciate how transformative this arms deal may become, we need to understand the regional and global systems of power it disrupts. Saudi Arabia and the United States have shaped Yemen's fate for decades. The Saudis intervened militarily in 2015 to crush the Houthi movement, which they believed aligned too closely with Iran. The United States supplied intelligence, aircraft maintenance, and diplomatic protection from international investigation. Western media, meanwhile, reduced Yemen to a story of extremist factions and tribal chaos, obscuring the fundamental economic logic. Yemen was being kept weak to ensure that Saudi Arabia remained the unchallenged regional gatekeeper and that the United States remained the ultimate authority over security in the Gulf. But years of bombing did not produce submission. Instead, Yemen developed its own weapons, from ballistic missiles to long-range drones. It gained the ability to strike Saudi oil facilities and disrupt Gulf shipping lanes. It forced Saudi Arabia to the negotiating table. Yemen learned a crucial lesson: countries with military leverage get treated as states. Countries without leverage get treated as territory. Thus, buying Sukhoi jets is not merely about defense, it is about shaping diplomatic power. The Russians understand this well. Their economy, while strained by sanctions, still has one great advantage: a vast industrial base capable of producing high-performance weapons. And as the West pours billions into Ukraine, attempting to keep Russia bogged down, Moscow responds not by hiding but by expanding global partnerships. It is telling the world, we are open for business. And if you challenge the United States, we will support you. That is how new alliances form, not through ideology, but through shared experiences of being targeted by the same imperial hierarchy. This is why the West's reaction is one of panic, not concern for regional peace. Western policymakers know what a strengthened Yemen means: the Gulf monarchies lose their dominance. Israel faces a new front of armed resistance. The U.S. Navy may soon have to negotiate access and presence in waters it once treated as guaranteed. A multipolar world, once theory, becomes material reality. But there is a social dimension that we must not ignore. Yemen's people have suffered under war capitalism, the destruction of life and infrastructure in pursuit of control. When a country is weakened, its workers become desperate. They accept low wages, migration, exploitation, dependence on aid. When a country rebuilds strength, its workers can demand better. They can ask for development resources to be used for hospitals, schools, electricity, and water, not only military expenditures. Yemen now stands at a crossroads. Russia has opened a door, but what Yemen builds after stepping through depends on whether economic resources are invested in society rather than concentrated in elites or spent entirely on war. If Yemen uses this new military leverage to force peace and gain fair economic arrangements, control over shipping revenue, mining resources in its territory, and fisheries along its coasts, then this deal becomes a turning point toward a functional, independent economy. If power consolidates into authoritarian hands without sharing the benefits, then a militarized elite may replace one form of domination with another. Capitalism always creates contradictions. The same weapons that can defend sovereignty can also enforce dictatorship. The same military spending that drives technical education can also starve civilian infrastructure. And so Yemen must choose: will it build an economy for the many or for the few? Still, the symbolic impact cannot be underestimated. For the first time in generations, Yemeni society can imagine itself not just surviving but shaping its destiny. Community morale, cultural pride, national unity, these forces matter economically. Workers fight harder for a nation they believe in. And what of the United States and Europe? Their reaction confirms what this deal reveals: Western hegemony relied not just on superior force but on the assumption that no one would dare break from their system. Now more nations in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America ask, why must our economies obey Western conditions? Why must our governments fear Western intervention? Why must our militaries depend on Western approval? The Yemen-Russia deal does not merely add jets to a war zone. It removes certainty from an empire that built its wealth on controlling others. The world is changing precisely because those who were once controlled now refuse to play that role any longer. Let us now look forward. The consequences of this arms deal extend into the future of global capitalism. For decades, the world economy functioned under the assumption of unipolarity. The U.S. military ensured access to resources, protected trade routes, and enforced financial dominance through the dollar. That arrangement produced profits for Western corporations and dependency for much of the global South. But this model is collapsing. Sanctions no longer isolate their targets, they push them into cooperation with each other. Russia, Iran, Yemen, China, Syria, North Korea, and perhaps soon others in Africa and Latin America, are forming alternative economic networks. These networks trade arms, oil, food, and technology without relying on Western systems like SWIFT banking or US dollars. That is what Washington fears. Not Yemen's jets, but Yemen's participation in a new economic bloc outside Western control. This is the beginning of what economists call systemic divergence, the moment when one dominant economic structure begins breaking into multiple competing